Hello everyone, welcome to our channel University of Political Science. Today I discusses about Seneca and the fathers of the church. In one respect, the belief in human equality, the idea of a common race, as it was developed by the jurists, broke sharply with the scale of values which prevailed in the city-state. In another respect, however, the two were quite continuous. For Cicero as for Plato, to found or to govern states is the labor in which the human hero shows himself most godlike, and a life of political service is the crown of human blessedness. The well-centralized system of authority presented in the Roman law reelects not only the administrative unity of the empire, but also the ancient conviction that the state is supreme among human institutions. In this tradition there was no thought of a divided allegiance in which another loyalty might compete with the claims of civic duty, and no impossible gulf between the dear city of Cecrops and the dear city of God. Yet this contrast between the earthly and the heavenly city, drawn by a Roman emperor and the most conscientious ruler of his age, was symptomatic of a cleft that was opening in men's moral experience. The weary loyalty of Marcus Aurelius toward the station to which it had pleased God to call him, and his obvious longing for a more satisfying life show how far even the pagan soul had traveled since the days when Cicero, in the dream cf. Scipio, envisaged heaven as a reward reserved for distinguished statesmanship. The ripe fruit of Marcus's world weariness was a church which claimed to be the spokesman for a spiritual life higher than any that earth afforded, but the fruit grew in a soil long prepared for it. Seneca and the fathers of the church. The changing valuation placed upon a political career, and the diminishing expectation that statesmanship would be able to deal successfully with social problems are clearly perceptible by a comparison of Cicero with Seneca, who wrote about a century later, and who therefore reflects Roman opinion in the early days of the empire, as Cicero reflects it in the closing period of the Republic. The contrast is the more striking because there is little difference of a systematic sort between the philosophical beliefs of the two men. Both held an eclectic stoicism for which nature represents a standard of goodness and reasonableness. Both men, also, look upon the great age republic as the time at which Rome achieved her political maturity when she has latterly declined. But there is this essential difference: Cicero has the illusion that the great day may be recaptured, but for the minister of Nero the time of illusion has passed. Rome has fallen into senility, corruption is everywhere, and despotism is inevitable. Upon social and political matters Seneca already shows much of the despondency and pessimism that overshadows the Latin literature of the second Christian century. The question is not whether there shall be absolute government, but only who shall be the despot. Even dependence upon a despot is preferable to dependence upon the people, since the mass of men is so vicious and corrupt that it is more merciless than a tyrant. Clearly then, a political career has little to offer the good man except the annihilation of his goodness, and clearly also the good man can do little for his fellows by holding political office. For similar reasons Seneca attached little importance to differences between forms of government. One is as bad or as good as another since none can accomplish much. Yet it was by no means Seneca's view that the wise man ought merely to withdraw from society. He insisted as strongly as Cicero upon the moral duty of the good man to offer his services in some capacity or other, and he was as decisive as Cicero in rejecting the Epicurean pursuit of private satisfaction sought by the neglect of public interests. Unlike Cicero, however, and indeed unlike all political and social philosophers before his time, Seneca was able to envisage a social service which involved no office in the state, and no function of a strictly political sort. This gives a definitely new turn to the ancient Stoic doctrine that every man is a member of two commonwealths, the civil state of which he is a subject, and the greater state, composed of all rational beings, to which he belongs by virtue of his humanity. The greater commonwealth is for Seneca a society rather than a state. Its ties are moral or religious rather than legal and political. Accordingly, the wise and good man renders a service to humanity even though he has no political power. He does this by virtue of his moral relation to his fellows, or even through philosophical contemplation alone. The man who, by virtue of his thought, becomes a teacher of mankind fills a place at once nobler and more influential than the political ruler. It would scarcely be forcing Seneca's meaning to say that the worship of God is itself a truly human service, as Christian writers taught. The significance of Seneca's attitude in this respect would be difficult to exaggerate. Seneca's Stoicism, like that of Marcus Aurelius a century later, was substantially a religious faith which, while offering strength and consolation in this world, turned toward the contemplation of a spiritual life. This drawing apart of worldly and spiritual interests the sense that the body is but chains and darkness to the soul, and that the soul must struggle continually against the burden of the flesh, was a real characteristic even of the pagan society in which Christianity grew up. The growing need for spiritual consolation to religion an ever higher place in men's regard and set it ever more apart from secular interests, as the only means of contact with a higher range of realities. The essentially secular unity of life in the classical age was breaking down, and religion was achieving more and more an independent footing beside, or even above the life of the state. It was but a natural sequel to this growing independence. When the interests of religion were able to embody themselves in an institution of their own, to represent on earth the rights and the duties which overshared as the members of a heavenly city. Such an institution, already taking form in the Christian Church, must by the very logic of its existence lay hold upon men's loyalty by a claim which it could not permit the state to adjudicate. Seneca's interpretation of the two commonwealths was only one of several surprising parallels between his thought and that of the Christians, parallels which produced in antiquity a body of forged letters supposed to have passed between him and St. Paul. Two other related aspects of Seneca's thought were closely connected with the prevailingly religious tone of his philosophy. On the one hand, he was intensely conscious of the inherent sinfulness of human nature, and on the other his ethics showed the tendency toward humanitarianism which became continually more marked in later Stoicism. Despite the fact that Seneca repeats the Stoic commonplaces about the self-sufficiency of the wise man, the moral pride and harshness of earlier Stoicism have greatly receded. The sense of human wickedness haunts him, and wickedness is ineradicable. No one escapes it, and virtue consists rather in an endless struggle for salvation than in its achievement. Probably it is this consciousness of sin and misery as a universal human quality that caused him to place so high a value on human sympathy and gentleness, virtues which had not been very characteristic of Stoicism in its more rigorous versions. Already the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man have taken on the connotation of love and goodwill toward all mankind which came to characterize Christian teaching. As the civic and political virtues dropped back into second place, the virtues of mercy, kindliness, charity, benevolence, tolerance, and love, together with the condemnation on moral grounds of cruelty, hatred, anger, and harshness toward dependents and inferiors, were given a far higher place in the moral scale than they ever had in earlier ethics. The effects of this humanitarianism were apparent in the classical Roman law, especially in placing safeguards about the property and the persons of women and dependent children, in protecting slaves, in a more humane treatment of criminals, and in a common policy of protecting the helpless. It is a curious fact that a strong feeling for the humanitarian virtues should have first appeared as the accompaniment of a growing sense of moral corruption, both being definitely departures from the ethical sentiments of the earlier period of antiquity. Probably both were aspects of a more contemplative attitude toward life, which now replaced the older belief that the supreme virtue was the service of the state. Seneca's departure from the ancient belief that the state is the highest agency of moral perfection was strikingly marked by his glowing account of the Golden Age which, as he conceived, preceded the sophisticated age of civilization. In his 90th letter he described this idyllic state of nature with something approaching the rhetorical enthusiasm which Rousseau expended upon the same subject in the 18th century. In the Golden Age, as he believed, men were still happy and innocent. They loved a simple life without the superfluity and luxuries of civilization. They were not, indeed, either wise or morally perfect, for their goodness resulted rather from the innocence of ignorance than from practiced virtue. In particular, in the state of nature as Seneca pictured it, men had not yet acquired that grace agency of greed, the institution of private property. In fact, it was the growth of avarice which destroyed the condition of primitive purity. Moreover, so long as men remained pure, they had no need for government or law. They obeyed voluntarily the wisest and best men, who sought no advantage of their own in ruling over their fellows. But when men were smitten with the desire to make things their own, they became self-seeking and rulers became tyrants. The advance of the arts brought luxury and corruption. It was this train of consequences that made law and coercion necessary in order that the vices and corruptions of human nature might be curbed. In short, government is the necessary remedy for wickedness. The glorification of an idyllic state of nature, already suggested in certain passages of Plato's laws, and now elaborated by Seneca, has played a not inconsiderable role in utopian political theory. Whether thrown back into the past, as by Seneca and Rousseau, or projected into the future, as by the utopian socialists, it has usually had the same purpose: to bring into high relief the vices and corruptions of mankind, and to indict the political or the economic abuses of an age. In the case of Seneca, the Golden Age was another expression of his haunting sense of decay in the Roman society of Nero's reign. For reasons that are not hard to understand, his view that private property did not exist in a state of nature would hardly be shared by lawyers, who apparently regarded ownership as strictly in accord with natural law. The closest analog in the case of the lawyers was perhaps slavery, which, as was said in the preceding chapter, was sometimes regarded. In general, Seneca's conception of the law as a mere cure for sin was wholly at odds with Ulpian's description of it as a true philosophy. But Seneca's idea of the state of nature might well commend itself to Christian theologians. The belief in a primitive condition of purity was implied by the story of the fall of man, and certainly it became among Christian writers not uncommon to conceive this condition as one of communism, and one in which force would not be needed. Such a view would be almost necessary after it became settled doctrine that poverty was morally superior to riches, and monasticism to a secular life. It is important to note, however, that this doctrine, whether in Seneca or in Christian writers, was in no sense a subversive attack upon property or upon law and government. What is implied is merely that these institutions represent an ethical second best. In a perfect society, or with a purified human nature, they would not be necessary. But the wickedness of mankind being what it is, private property may well be a useful institution, and law supported by force may well be quite indispensable. It is easy to hold at once that government arises solely from human wickedness, and yet that it is the divinely appointed means for ruling mankind in its fallen state, and so has an indefeasible claim upon the obedience of all good men. This in fact became common Christian belief. At the same time, Seneca's representation of government as a more or less makeshift remedy for human evil was the index of an enormous shift in moral opinion, not only from the estimate set upon political institutions by the Greek philosophers, but even from that supported only a short time before by Cicero. It would be hard to exaggerate the discrepancy between Seneca's view and the ancient conception expressed in Aristotle's belief that the city-state is the necessary condition of a civilized life, and the only means for bringing human faculties to their highest form of development. The change implied by Seneca's position on the function of the state is precisely comparable to that implied by Cicero's position on human equality. Taken together, the two changes undermine completely the ancient valuation of politics. In place of the supreme value of citizenship, there is a common equality shared by all sorts and conditions of men, and in place of the state as a positive agency of human perfection, there is a coercive power that struggles ineffectually to make an earthly life tolerable. Though this revolutionary change in the scale of values is yet only suggested, its implications were destined to be explored, and to become more and more firmly embedded in the political philosophy of the Christian Fathers. More information, please visit our website www.politicalscienceview.com. Thanks. See again to new topics.